The garden bloomed red that morning. Between the rows of tomatoes and corn, something pale pushed through the dark Tennessee soil. Master Whitmore bent down, thinking it was a root or stone. His scream shattered the dawn silence. 5 human hands, fingers spread like dying flowers, planted in his prized vegetable garden. The earth around them was rich with blood, not water. This is the true story of Levi of Tennessee, the enslaved man who turned his master's garden into a graveyard and made the soil remember every lash, every chain, every stolen breath. It was September 12, 1835, on Riverside Plantation outside Nashville. What began as another day of harvest ended as the most terrifying reckoning in Tennessee history. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The garden bloomed red that morning. Between the rows of tomatoes and corn, something pale pushed through the dark Tennessee soil. Master Whitmore bent down, thinking it was a root or stone. His scream shattered the dawn silence. 5 human hands, fingers spread like dying flowers, planted in his prized vegetable garden. The earth around them was rich with blood, not water. The morning mist hung heavy over Riverside Plantation, but it could not hide what Levi had sown in the night. Levi stood 30 feet away, hoe in hand, his face calm as still water. He watched Master Whitmore stumble backward, watched him fall to his knees in the dirt he had forced others to work. The hands belonged to overseers, to slave catchers, to men who had used those same hands to break bodies and spirits. Now they fed the earth they had poisoned with cruelty. The workers gathered slowly, their eyes wide with terror and something else. Something that looked like satisfaction. They had seen those hands strike their children, had felt those fingers tighten around their throats, had watched those palms count out coins for their flesh. Now the hands lay still, pale as mushrooms in the morning light. Riverside Plantation stretched along the Cumberland River like a scar across the Tennessee hills. The big house sat on a rise, white columns gleaming, while below it the slave quarters huddled in rows like broken teeth. The fields rolled down to the water, cotton and tobacco and corn, all watered with sweat and tears. It was beautiful land, made ugly by what happened on it. Levi had been born on Riverside in 1805, 30 years of chains and lashes, and watching his people disappear like smoke. His mother, Sarah, had been sold when he was 12, dragged away screaming his name. His father, Moses, had been whipped to death for trying to learn to read. His sister, Grace, had been taken to the big house one night and never came back whole. Master Whitmore was not the first owner, but he was the worst. He had bought Riverside from a bankrupt planter in 1830, along with 67 human beings who came with the deed like livestock. Whitmore was young, maybe 35, with pale eyes and soft hands that had never known real work. He had money from his father's shipping business in Memphis, and he had ideas about how to make slaves more productive. Whitmore believed in breaking spirits the way you break horses. Slow, methodical, complete. He hired overseers who shared his vision, men like Jasper Kane who enjoyed his work too much, men like Dutch Muller who had been kicked off other plantations for his cruelty, men like Tom Briggs who collected scars the way other men collected coins. The garden had been Levi's assignment since childhood. He had green fingers, they said, could make anything grow. Whitmore took pride in his vegetables, served them to guests, bragged about his slave's talent. Every morning Levi worked the soil, planted seeds, pulled weeds, harvested food that filled bellies in the big house while the quarters went hungry. Levi learned the garden's secrets. Which plants needed sun, which thrived in shade, how deep to plant, when to water, what the soil needed to produce life. He learned that earth remembers everything you put in it. Blood feeds the roots. Pain makes things grow strong. The garden taught him patience, taught him to wait for the right season. The first overseer to disappear was Tom Briggs. He vanished on a Tuesday night in August after spending the day flogging a field hand named Samuel for moving too slow. Briggs was known for his iron fists, for breaking fingers when slaves couldn't pick fast enough. He wore brass knuckles that left permanent marks, scars that branded his victims forever. They found Briggs 3 days later, or what was left of him. His body lay in the tobacco barn, hands severed clean at the wrists. The cuts were precise, made with something sharp and sure. No one could explain how he had died, how his hands had been removed, how his blood had drained so completely that he looked like dried leather. Master Whitmore raged for hours, threatened to whip every slave until someone confessed. But the field hands had been working in groups, all accounted for. The house slaves had witnesses. Even Levi, who found the body, had been seen tending the garden by multiple people. The mystery deepened like roots in rich soil. Dutch Muller disappeared next, 2 weeks later. He had spent the evening drinking and bragging about the slave woman he intended to visit in the quarters. His specialty was forcing himself on the young women, using his position to take what was never freely given. He carried a knife with a bone handle, carved with notches for each woman he had violated. Muller's body turned up in the river, bloated and pale. His hands were gone, cut off with the same precision as Briggs. The knife with its shameful notches was found buried in the garden, among the bean plants Levi tended with such care. Whitmore brought in the sheriff, who questioned everyone, found nothing, left empty-handed. Jasper Kane lasted until September. He was the cruelest of them all, a man who laughed when children cried, who made games of others' pain. Kane had killed at least 3 slaves during his time at Riverside, claimed they died of natural causes, buried them in unmarked graves beyond the cotton fields. Kane knew he was being hunted. He slept with pistols, hired men to watch his back, never went anywhere alone. It didn't matter. They found him in his cabin at dawn, throat opened like a smile, hands missing like the others. The cabin was locked from inside, windows too small for a man to climb through. No one could explain how death had found him. The 3 sets of hands had vanished completely. Whitmore searched everywhere, had the slaves' quarters torn apart, drained the well, even dug up parts of the cemetery. Nothing. The hands had disappeared as if they never existed. But Levi knew where they were. Buried deep in the garden soil, feeding the vegetables that grew so unusually large that season. The morning Master Whitmore found them, the hands had finally pushed through the earth like pale plants seeking sun. 5 hands in total, because Kane had been born with an extra finger on his left hand, a deformity he had hidden beneath gloves. Now all 5 lay exposed in the morning light, fingers curled as if still grasping for victims. Whitmore stumbled backward, his face white as the hands in his garden. He pointed a shaking finger at Levi, who stood calmly among the vegetables he had tended so carefully. "You," Whitmore whispered. "You did this." Levi said nothing. He had not spoken a word in 5 years, not since the night they took his sister. His silence was deeper than graves, harder than the hands that now decorated the garden like grotesque flowers. He simply looked at his master with eyes that held 30 years of carefully cultivated hate. The other slaves gathered in a circle around the garden. They stared at the hands, at Levi, at Master Whitmore trembling in his nightgown. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers. A few smiled, quick and secret, before hiding their faces again. Samuel, whose broken fingers had healed crooked thanks to Tom Briggs, knelt beside one of the hands. It was pale and waxy, dirt caked under the fingernails, wedding ring still gleaming on the 4th finger. "Jasper Kane," he said quietly. "I know that ring." An old woman named Ruth touched another hand with her walking stick. The flesh was firm still, preserved by the cool earth and Levi's careful tending. Dutch Muller, she confirmed. See that scar across the palm? He got that trying to cut my grandson. The third hand belonged to Tom Briggs, identified by the brass knuckle still embedded in the knuckles. The brass had turned green in the soil like old coins. The fourth and fifth hands were canes, the extra finger twisted and pale, a deformity that had made him even crueler in life. Master Whitmore backed away from the garden, from the hands, from Levi's unblinking stare. "Sheriff," he stammered. "Get the sheriff. Get the dogs. Get everyone." But the slaves did not move. They formed a tighter circle around the garden, around Levi, around the evidence of their impossible justice. For the first time in years, they did not obey immediately. They stood still as stones, watching their master's fear bloom like flowers in his prized garden. Levi finally moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and sharp. A grafting knife, the tool he used to join different plants together, to make them grow as one. The blade was clean and bright, though everyone knew it had recently been busy. He held it up so the morning sun caught the steel. Then Levi did something he had not done in 5 years. He opened his mouth and spoke. His voice was rusty from disuse, rough as tree bark, but every word was clear. "Master," he said, looking directly into Whitmore's pale eyes, "your garden needs more fertilizer." The silence that followed was complete. Even the birds stopped singing. The river seemed to pause in its flowing. The earth itself held its breath, waiting to see what would grow from this moment. Master Whitmore's hand went to his throat, as if he could feel phantom fingers tightening there. His eyes darted from the hands in the garden to the knife in Levi's grip, to the circle of slaves who no longer looked afraid. For the first time in his life, Whitmore understood what it felt like to be hunted. The sheriff arrived an hour later with 6 men and twice as many dogs. They found Master Whitmore locked in his study, barricaded behind furniture, clutching a rifle with shaking hands. They found the hands still planted in the garden, fingers spread like dying stars. They found 67 slaves working quietly in the fields, going about their daily tasks as if nothing had changed. They did not find Levi. The slaves claimed ignorance, as they always did when white men asked questions. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. The hands? Perhaps they had always been there, buried by previous owners, pushed up by recent rains. Levi, he had been working the garden that morning, then simply vanished like morning mist. The sheriff's dogs picked up a scent that led to the river, then disappeared in the water. Bloodhounds circled the garden, whining and backing away from the planted hands. Even the most vicious tracking dogs refused to get close to what Levi had sown. Days passed. The hands began to wither in the sun, fingers curling inward, flesh turning dark. Whitmore refused to touch them, refused to let anyone remove them. He said they were evidence, but everyone knew he was afraid to disturb what Levi had planted. The garden began to smell like death and rich earth mixed together. Strange things started happening at Riverside Plantation. Plants grew too fast. Vegetables came up twisted and strange. The well water turned red for 3 days, then cleared without explanation. Slaves reported seeing Levi in the fields at dawn and dusk, always at the edge of sight, always carrying his grafting knife. Master Whitmore hired new overseers, but they never lasted long. The first one quit after finding bloody handprints on his cabin door. The second left when his horse was found with its mane braided into 5-fingered knots. The third simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only his boots, perfectly arranged by his bedside. Word spread along the river, from plantation to plantation, carried by boat crews and traveling merchants. They spoke of the slave who planted hands, who made the earth remember its debts. Some called it legend, others nightmare. But every overseer who heard the story looked twice at the slaves who worked his land. Master Whitmore sold Riverside Plantation in November, barely 3 months after finding the hands in his garden. He claimed the land was cursed, the soil poisoned. The new owner, a man from Kentucky, paid half the asking price and thought he had gotten a bargain. He learned better within a week. The new master tried to plow under the garden, to erase what Levi had planted. But every time the soil was turned, more pieces surfaced. Finger bones, knuckle joints, pieces of brass and rings. The earth seemed determined to remember, to keep pushing up evidence of what had been buried there. Levi was seen occasionally over the years, always at the edge of vision, always carrying his tools. Slaves on other plantations reported a tall man with sad eyes and green fingers, who could make anything grow. He helped runaways find their way north, they said. He taught others how to tend gardens that would bloom with justice. Some claimed Levi had escaped to Canada, where he grew vegetables for freed slaves. Others insisted he had never left Tennessee, that he still walked the river bottoms at night, tending wild gardens that sprouted in hidden places. A few whispered that he had died that morning in the garden, that what people saw was something else, something that the earth had given back. The truth was simpler and stranger than any legend. Levi had learned the deepest secret of gardening, the one that Master Whitmore never understood despite owning acres of fertile land. You reap what you sow. The earth remembers everything you plant in it. Feed it cruelty, and cruelty grows back. Feed it justice, and justice blooms like flowers. 20 years later, during the war between the states, Union soldiers camped on the old riverside land. They found strange things growing wild in the abandoned garden. Vegetables twisted into the shape of hands, vines that seemed to reach and grasp, roots that looked like fingers buried in the earth. The soldiers left that place alone. Local folks said it was haunted, but the freed slaves knew better. It was not haunted by ghosts, but by memory. The land remembered what had been planted there, remembered the hands that had done evil and the hands that had done justice. It kept growing both, season after season, until the earth itself became a testament. Old-timers in Nashville still tell the story when the moon is dark and the river runs quiet. They speak of Levi the gardener who taught the soil to remember, who planted justice in rows like corn. They warn that the earth never forgets what you bury in it, never stops growing what you feed it. In the abandoned garden at Riverside, wildflowers bloom every spring. 5 varieties that grow nowhere else in Tennessee, with petals the color of old bone and leaves that curl like fingers. Botanists have tried to classify them, but the flowers resist all attempts at naming. They simply grow season after season, tended by hands no one can see. The river still flows past the old plantation, carrying stories downstream to the Mississippi and beyond. Sometimes on foggy mornings, people claim to see a tall man working the riverbank, planting seeds in the dark soil. When they look closer, there is no one there, only the smell of rich earth and growing things, and the feeling that the land itself is watching. Children in the area know not to pick the strange flowers that grow wild along the Cumberland. Their grandparents taught them that some gardens are not meant for harvesting, that some plants grow for reasons deeper than hunger. They learned that justice once planted grows forever, sending up new shoots every spring. The last known sighting of Levi was in 1863, when a Union regiment was crossing the Cumberland River near the old plantation. A scout reported seeing a slave working a small garden on the riverbank, growing vegetables for the soldiers. When the captain went to thank the man for his kindness, he found only an empty garden and freshly turned soil. But the vegetables were there, arranged in neat rows, perfectly ripe and ready for harvest. The soldiers ate well that night, and later said they had never tasted food so satisfying, so rich with the flavor of justice finally served. Some claimed they could taste freedom itself in every bite. That night, around the campfire, the oldest soldier told a story he had heard from an escaped slave. He spoke of a gardener who planted memories, who made the earth remember every debt, every unpaid price. He said that Levi still walked the river bottoms, still tended wild gardens where justice grew like weeds, unstoppable and eternal. Master Whitmore died in Memphis in 1867, 2 years after the war ended. The doctors called it heart failure, but his servants whispered different stories. They said he had been found in his garden, clutching his throat, eyes wide with terror. They said the vegetables in his plot had all grown in the shape of grasping hands, reaching up from the soil like dying men clawing for air. The coroner found soil under Whitmore's fingernails, rich black earth that matched no garden in Memphis. Chemical analysis showed traces of bone meal, blood, and something else the scientists could not identify. Something that made the soil unnaturally fertile, unnaturally alive, with memory and purpose. Today, historians debate whether Levi really existed or was simply folklore born from the pain of slavery. They point to the lack of records, the impossibility of the story, the way legends grow from desperate hope. But in the hills of Tennessee, where the Cumberland River runs dark and quiet, people know better. They know that some stories are too true for history books, too real for records kept by masters who owned human beings like livestock. They know that justice has its own logic, its own seasons, its own way of growing in soil watered with tears and blood. The garden at Riverside Plantation is gone now, paved over by a shopping center built in the 1970s. But construction workers reported strange problems during the building. Tools disappeared, concrete cracked in patterns that looked like fingerprints, and flowers kept pushing up through the asphalt no matter how many times they were removed. The shopping center never prospered. Stores opened and closed quickly, owners complaining of cold spots, strange smells, and the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. The local newspaper attributed it to poor location and bad luck. But older residents knew the real reason. Some ground remembers too well to be paved over. In 2010, the shopping center was demolished to make way for a memorial park. When the bulldozers broke through the old foundation, they uncovered rich black soil beneath the concrete. The soil was so fertile that wildflowers bloomed within days. 5 strange varieties that botanists still cannot fully classify. The memorial park is peaceful now, a place where families picnic and children play. But sometimes, early in the morning or late in the evening, groundskeepers find vegetables growing wild among the planned flowers. Tomatoes and corn and beans, perfectly tended by hands no one can see, growing in soil that remembers everything planted there. If this story planted something in your heart, leave your mark. Like, subscribe, and share it with those who understand that justice once sown grows eternal. The earth remembers every seed, every story, every debt that must be paid. And somewhere in Tennessee, in gardens both seen and unseen, Levi's harvest continues to grow.